Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope, coming to you once again from Toronto, Canada. The first segment of today's show, we're going to discuss the latest surrounding Bolivia and the political crisis in that country. Has a coup been carried out, or should Morales have resigned in the fashion that he did? What of then the interim president at this point in time? Does she have legitimacy to be president of Bolivia at this time? And also then, what of the indigenous people who were Bolivia's president's ex-president now, Morales' main supporters? Will they now be sidelined in the country? And what then of their rights, as well as democratic rights, amongst others, at this time also? Let's discuss all of that a bit further, because it's certainly a complex situation there in Bolivia, with a lot of people saying this is showing a tide which is turning against leftist governments, or quote-unquote socialist governments as well, in Latin America. We're joined now by Luis Castro, who is a Latin American analyst, TV producer, and presenter. He's joining us now from Barcelona in Spain. We're also joined by Meruan, who is a Latin America correspondent for German TV and an expert in part on Latin American affairs as well. He's joining us from Berlin. Meruan and Luis, thank you both for your time today. Luis, let me start with you. What do you make of Morales' resignation? Should he have stepped down?
Thanks for the invitation. I cannot really talk on behalf of President Morales whether he should have done it or not. I know what he did it. He did it because the level of violence in Bolivia was growing faster and faster. And not many people actually know that the history of independence of Bolivia has been completely full of military coups through the last 2 centuries. About 188 military coups have succeeded in Bolivia since independence in 1825. And it's an important data, because that means that Evo Morales knew what kind of society he's managing, what kind of society he's driving. So he knew that this was not going to end up in a good port, and he thought that maybe by stepping down, he would sort of invite the opposition for a dialogue and the so famous democracy that they always claim to sort of play. And but I don't think he saw what's going on right now coming, because by all means, it is indeed a coup d'etat against the government of Bolivia. It is indeed inconstitutional, the fact that the lady Janine Áñez is pretending to be self-proclaimed president, because there are several constitutional steps that needs to be taken into consideration first before you appoint a new president in Bolivia, which we might discuss further into the conversation, exactly how things should have been carried out.
Sure. So, Meruan, I want your point of view on that, Meruan, because what Luis there pointed out and laid out for us is the point of view of those on the side of Morales itself. And I've, of course, read that point of view in great detail. But as you know, Meruan, the U.S. and other countries who have always really been against Morales himself and his rule are celebrating this move and are saying this is good for democracy. Which side do you side? Which side do you stand on?
Well, it's been very difficult even for the countries in the region as well to take a side, because nobody can deny the prosperity and the economic growth that Morales brought to the country in his time. But actually, he did manage to do 2 big mistakes in the last years. One of them was regarding the referendum was giving him a legitimate 4th term. Regarding the referendum who voted for no for his 4th term, he succeeded to get a high court resolution to go on a campaign for the 4th term. And actually, there was at 51% no from the people of Bolivia, and he should have considered this. And the other thing is that the election on the 20th of October went in a curious and very suspicious way, so we can say, because starting to saying the results, announcing the results, it was shown that he was not able to get the majority of the votes. So in one in the night, it went the High Commission of Election. They stopped announcing the election results for about 24 hours. And after that, they came back with an announcement that he got the majority. So it was very suspicious for the opposition and for the people who didn't vote for him. So they thought he's doing a coup against the democracy. But nevertheless, he brought the country very far.
Yeah, indeed. On that point you just made there, Meruan, I want to put that to because Meruan pointed out two very important instances. We can talk about, of course, the fourth term and the referendum on that and how that played out and then went to the High Court. And secondly, then on the elections themselves and the irregularities that even the OAS says it's found there within those elections. Do you think essentially Morales became power hungry?
Well, first of all, whatever the OAS says is pointless at this point, because anything that is related to their interest in the region is obviously anti-democratic, dictatorial, etc., etc. So it's the example of, because as you have been following, there have been also protests in Chile and Ecuador, in Panama and Honduras, and the OAS has not said anything about that. Coming back to Bolivia, the problem is that, as you were mentioning, there was a referendum in 2016 where Evo Morales was asking the public opinion to allow an amendment in the constitution for him to run for the fourth time. That referendum went negative. However, what has not been discussed much in the media anywhere, well, at least I haven't seen it, is the fact that the result of that referendum was only about 2.5% different. And on top of that, the OAS, back at the time in 2016, they actually audited this referendum and said that the referendum had irregularities. The only difference is that back at the time, they did not say, it's a fraud. So this time, they decided to come in 2019, run an audit authorized and negotiated by Evo Morales. Don't forget about that. He actually said, okay, let's open the door and let's do an audit of these elections. Yeah. And but this time, they found irregularities. So you might wonder, well, is that a problem in the actual voting system in Bolivia that needs to be addressed? Because constant irregularities is a little bit of a problem. However, to immediately jump to the conclusion that it was a fraud and call the election a fraudulent, when in fact, let's never forget that the election so far was always led by Evo Morales. By the time on the 20th of October, in the evening, Evo Morales was leading the elections anyway. The problem is that Carlos Mesa, his opposition leader, he was actually looking into a second round. In Bolivia, you need a majority to sort of win on the first round. And all Carlos Mesa was looking for was the second round. So this is what it makes it all absurd. It's like, in fact, Evo Morales, they never said that Evo Morales did actually not win the election. They're just saying that they won a second replay. So how come they don't become, out of the sudden, from a wish to a second replay to an actual coup d'etat the way it is right now?
Let me go on to our other guests right now, Meruan, for the moment. Meruan, tell us about what your thoughts are vis-a-vis the indigenous population of Bolivia, because that's an important factor in all of this, where Evo Morales, a lot of his support, of course, comes from the indigenous population of Bolivia, and they're quite worried now about what happens to them, considering even Janine Áñez has, in the past at least, made some quite right-wing statements when it comes to the indigenous.
Yeah, well, I think there is some cultural issues there, but actually Morales did a lot for them, for the indigenous people, and he also secured their rights in the constitution. And that's why even people from around other indigenous communities around the world, they refer to the Bolivian constitution as the nearest to the rights of the indigenous people in the world. So actually there was some incidents in the last weeks attacking indigenous people as they are supporters of Morales, but it's probably going to be secured. Their rights will be secured through the constitution. And actually, Morales did take a lot of poverty away from the country when he when he took power in 2006. There was like 38% of poverty, extreme poverty, and he succeeded till now to reduce it to 15% only. So, and most of the poverty come between the indigenous community. So, I think it's very important to indigenous people to have their rights and to keep on securing their rights through the constitution, the Bolivian constitution.
Let me add another conversation. We also have Raphael. We've moved on to talking about the indigenous population of Bolivia. Do you think that they are now in danger of once again possibly losing their rights? And as we know with Añez, she doesn't really have a very positive point of view on the indigenous to begin with, at least when past statements of hers.
Okay, so firstly, we need to take into perspective, Waqar, that the indigenous population is 62% approximately of the Bolivian population. They did not vote for Morales in a uniform way. It was not an indigenous candidate versus a non-indigenous candidate. And Añez, I think now she needs to have the perspective that she will have to govern for all of Bolivia, regardless of her past statements. It's really way too early to say, within days of Morales' resignation, that the rights of the indigenous population, which have been won over the past 14 years, are now in danger or are all to be lost altogether. There are certainly some worrying signs, not exactly from Añez or from Morales' contender Carlos Mesa, but specifically from figures from the Department of Santa Cruz, which is a mostly non-indigenous department in the country's east, and the figure of Luis Fernando Camacho, which is a radical oppositionist, who is said to have said racist statements in the past. At the same time, we need to remember that many non-Morales affiliated indigenous leaderships came out against what they called an electoral fraud in the October 20th elections. Most notably is the leader of the Department of Potosi Civic Committee, Marco Pumari, who is an indigenous leader, and several coca growers and farmers have participated in the protests in La Paz, and some have even received Luis Fernando Camacho when he arrived in La Paz, even despite his alleged racist past. So the situation is really way too complex and way too quickly evolving to say that this is a racist victory against indigenous rights. That would be oversimplifying it.
And that's a very good point you made there, Raphael. So, Louis, let me go to you then with this. It's less black and white then, isn't it, Louise, as we've shown in this situation? I mean, it's more about how Morales may have overstepped his boundaries. And as Raphael there also described, it's not like all indigenous support Morales. And Morales does have, even within the indigenous population, those who are critics of him.
Yes, indeed. And President Morales never denied that. Like, he obviously, within the indigenous movement and within the indigenous society in Bolivia, there are obviously different perspectives of how to run things. But that's what democracy is about. And this is the democracy that Evo Morales brought to Bolivia for the last 14 years. Don't forget what I mentioned at the beginning. This is a country that is not used to this kind of stability. They're always overthrowing presidents. People are resigning. There are coup d'etats going on here and there. It's the country with the biggest amount of coup d'etat in the history of South America since independence. So that's why this is important to mention. And I'm going to make the point that what is being broken here is the actual constitution of Bolivia. There is one main issue regarding all this succession with Janine, Añez, etc., etc. President Morales resigned the National Assembly must accept or reject his resignation. They haven't done so. So therefore, Evo Morales is still legally the president of Bolivia. And the assembly has not been able to meet because every single time they go into the palace, there are protests, they don't let them in, the military sort of like start fighting it. I was yesterday publishing in my social media videos coming from La Paz that show the militaries were actually like not allowing the senators and deputies to enter the building. So how are they supposed to even meet to discuss first the resignation of President Morales, and second, the resignation of the President of the Senate, Adriana Salvatierra? Because what's happened here is that in the order of succession, the vice president of the country should have taken over, but he also resigned. Then it comes to the president of the Senate, which she resigned, but once again, the Senate has not accepted or rejected her resignation. So that's why, therefore, she should be still in the line. So Janine Áñez is nothing but like the same thing that Juan Guaidó is in Venezuela. It's somebody that just self-proclaimed president, and she's not following the constitution. And if you might allow me to sort of
we're going to leave it on that. I Luis, but we have unfortunately run out of time. This was, of course, a short segment on this situation in Bolivia. We'll, of course, revisit this because I'm sure there will be developments in the coming days. I'm going to thank all three of my guests for putting this all into context for us as best as they could in the short period of time they were given, Luis, Meruan, and Raphael, and of course for giving us their individual insights into this. Certainly the situation, viewers, in Bolivia is not black and white. It's not as simple as that. There are inconsistencies really on both sides. We can argue about even the military's role, which we weren't able to in great detail within this segment at this point in time. We'll try to revisit that. But the military essentially, quote unquote, advising the president of the country to resign. That many would call and have called a military coup. Is that legitimate? Is that a legitimate accusation? And then Janine Áñez, the way that she's come into power, as Luis there at the end was legitimately saying, the assembly hasn't even been able to meet because there are genuine security concerns for lawmakers to even be able to come in to actually carry out everything according to the Constitution, be it the acceptance of resignations, be it the appointment of Áñez as the new interim president, etc. None of that is actually happening as it should within a country of law and order. We'll keep a close eye on that situation here in Bolivia, here in Scope. I'll be back, though, with my second segment after this break. Stay tuned. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. In this second segment of today's show, we're going to discuss hate crimes going up, violent hate crimes, that is, going up in the United States, even though hate crimes overall have actually gone down in numbers, according to the FBI data. Now, violent hate crimes have gone up, specifically when we talk about the Hispanic/Latino community. According to the FBI, there was an increase of 21% in attacks against the Latinos or Hispanic community in 2018. Now, this is worrying, of course, on many levels, because this is within a context. The context being that the current president of the United States has spoken about the Hispanic/Latino community in very negative terms when it comes to the whole debate on the U.S.-Mexico border wall, when it comes to the whole immigration debate as a whole also. So let's discuss this a bit further. We're joined now by Mark Meirowitz, who is a professor at the State University of New York Maritime College, and he's also a politicist. He's joining us now from New York. Good morning, Mark. Thank you for joining us here in Scope. What do you make of these numbers that the FBI has released? Is it a surprise, really, that as the president has spoken very negatively about the Latino community, that crimes, violent hate crimes against them are going up?
Well, I'm not so sure about connecting the dots between the numbers and the, in terms of blaming the president. I mean, I looked at this report. I didn't read it in depth, but I read the reports about it. And of course, it's very disturbing. Overall, the whole tendency on hate crimes is very problematic, and the rise of the national and the white nationalists in the United States and a whole range of communities that are facing hate crimes, anti-Semitism, Muslims, LGBTQ, Hispanics, all these things are highlighted in the report. But to connect it up to Trump is, I think, problematic. Not saying that, what Trump says about immigration is always appropriate, but to connect it, I think, is problematic. Yes, there is a rise in white nationalism in this country, but it's based upon a very wide array of causes. And, to be very candid, social media, the ability of these groups to project themselves on social media, to get publicity for their activities is very, very important. And this society in the United States is in a very fraught situation. We're very polarized here. So this is kind of an offshoot of that. So kind of blaming people for things, it's a bad tendency. But blaming the president, I'm not quite ready to do it.
Okay, so but I mean, if I may push a point, if you allow me, Mark, because if we look at what the president has said about Latino community or just Mexicans in the past, rapists, etc., as you well know those statements, and then when it comes to this whole issue of the border wall as well, and again the way that argument has been framed, if he is not then directly to blame for this, has he not then allowed for the room to have such views then espoused?
Right. I'm skeptical about that connection. Not that the statements are appropriate. And that statement on the Mexicans, that goes back a long time already. So to connect up that statement with a rise in hate crimes in 2018 is tenuous. I'm not a statistician. I think that in the United States, Latins, Hispanics are a rising population in terms of influence and participation politically. So I see on that one side. So I'm skeptical about the connection. On the other hand, I'm worried about what we see in the report, not just on that issue, but across the board. The rise in hate crime and hate speech is at a point that is quite disturbing and very, very, very dangerous. So, to focus on this is fine. You're not going to be able to change Trump. And as long as Trump is Trump, he's going to make statements. He's going to talk about the border wall. And that does excite certain sensibilities in people. If you watch his rallies, they are very, full of excitement and also statements about things that are over the top. But that's Trump, and that's how Trump got into office. Question is he going to get reelected? Interesting point, which would show you where the country is at. On the other hand, fighting hate speech is a multifaceted issue in the schools, in social media, in society. So again, you can make it connect the dot, but then the question is, where do you go with it? And I don't know where you go with it, really.
Okay, let's add another voice to this conversation. Also joining us from New York is Begona Sevilla. I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly there, Begona. She's an international correspondent and an expert in Latino affairs as well. Thank you for your time this morning. Begona, what do you make of this FBI data? What does it mean for the Latino community in the U.S.?
So I would like to point out that there are two different times in this country. So there are two different stories and two different messages. So before talking about DACA, and because it's the thing now we have in our hands and it's on the table. So with Obama administration, things were very different. So I came to the United States. I was very lucky to come to the United States 5 years ago. And with Obama administration, things were very, very different in a very good way. And I don't want to say that I support Obama. I don't want to support Donald Trump. I don't want to be biased. But, for example, for the immigration processes, it was much easier than now. And with Donald Trump in the White House, things changed a lot in a big way, because I think that these statistics reflect that he is not taking care of the words and the way he is talking to the audience, talking to the citizens, American citizens and future American citizens. We need to take care of what we say. We need to think twice before saying that someone is illegal, which is illegal, saying that. We need to say undocumented person. And he needs to take into account that there are many people undocumented here that want to be legal, want to have a document to pay to the IRS, to be a citizen. And sometimes, I think that Donald Trump He's not choosing the proper words. And, and these statistics reflect that we need to take care of this. So, yes.
Okay, so let's one more voice, in fact, for this conversation. We're also now joined by Maryam Sarhan, who is a researcher of international studies and diplomacy at the University of London, SOAS. She's joining us now from Washington, D.C. Good morning, Maryam. What do you make of the situation right now when it comes to the Latino/Hispanic community and the increase in violent hate crimes against them, Maryam? Because an expert quoted about this issue or in reports about this data said that we're seeing the swapping of one divided group in the social political arena for another. What do you make of that, Maryam?
Thank you, Waqar. I think one of the most important things that we need to take into account is that the FBI report that came out with this data, in a way, does not show the entire picture, because if you take time to go through it and you find some of the details behind it, you'll see that there are a lot of states and cities in the U.S. that did not report data on hate crimes. And so what this tells us is that it's incomplete in the sense that there's a lot of it that we don't know, that we don't see on paper. And in reality, there's a lot more of it happening. These numbers also only refer to violent crimes, so like a criminal offense. So that wouldn't include instances of bias that are much more common, which would include things like bullying and discrimination in the workplace or in schools, whatever it may be. So this gives us a glimpse of the reality, but not the full picture, unfortunately. And, it's too simplistic to say, well, it's because of President Trump that these things are happening. Okay. There may be that may be a contributing factor, but this has been happening long before he became president. So people really need to be able to take into more factors when they are analyzing these issues, for sure.
Okay, so it goes back to what you were saying then, essentially, about how just blaming Donald Trump would be too simplistic. Do you think then, Mark, that the other issues and the other causes here for the rise, as you had said, of white nationalism, white supremacy, however we want to term that, those need to be addressed? How does one even begin that process, do you think?
Well, first of all, I thought the comments of Begona and Maryam were very, very on point. First of all, this is a nation of immigrants. My parents were immigrants. I'm a first-generation American. We have on our Statue of Liberty, give me your tired, you're poor. We can't forget that. And I think that's getting forgotten here to a large extent. And I assure you, Republicans and Democrats feel the same way about this issue. But again, there are problems in society, which Maryam highlights, which is a great point, which are there. And maybe Trump's statements bring those out, but they've been around for a while and they're now exacerbated. They're across the board. They're not just in Hispanic communities, but as I said, LGBTQ, anti-Semitism, Muslim Americans. This is an epidemic. And I agree with Maryam's point that many states and many localities don't report it. So the problem is probably much more epidemic, much more problematic than what's being reported. The question is, how do you address it? And I have to say about the word hate crime and hate speech, that many of the police departments and the law enforcement have a hard time distinguishing what is a hate crime and what is hate speech. We see this in New York all the time. Well, something happens with a particular person and they say, well, that's just a crime. Well, so the bottom line is we need to sit down and have a self-analysis. In a very free country with free speech, the way we have free speech, what has happened is people are taking advantage of that on the internet, on social media, and in person in this rise of violent crime to target people for their identity. And this is very problematic. We need introspection in this country to stop this. And it's going to be an effort that we're all going to have to get together to do. So again, I say Trump
Mark, I'm going to interrupt just because unfortunately we're running out of time. I do apologize for that. I just wanted to give the final word to Begona, if you allow me. Begona, do you think that the U.S. needs stricter hate speech laws? Is that what needs to happen?
What I think is that these statistics are not very good. What I think is that we need to change the country. What I think is there is so much disinformation in this country and ignorancy. And there are many people who are ignorant. And why? Because the education system is not public like in Europe. And I'm always saying that, I always say that to many people in the United States. So when you have uneducated citizens and they are free to think what they want to think, it's good. And you would avoid these kind of statistics, and you will open mind, you will have more, I would say, a wider open minds in this country. So these statistics are no good, and we need to work on it. We need to have a health public system like in Europe, and we need to have uneducated people to avoid this. And and another responsibility is the administration. The government needs to be responsible and needs to do something, in order to educate people, in order to avoid this and have a better place here. And,
so we'll leave the conversation there at that point of education there. Begona, apologies again for cutting you off. Unfortunately, the clock has gotten the best of us. But that's a very, I think, pertinent point to actually end off on, because ignorance many times does lead to hate, as we know, even around the world, really. Let me thank all of our guests, Mark, Begona, and Maryam, for their time this morning, speaking to us respectively from New York and Washington, D.C., and for, of course, giving their insight to us. This is an issue which, again, as all three of our guests agreed, essentially is not as simple as just saying Donald Trump is behind all of this. These issues existed way before him as well, and possibly would exist even after him. If this trend does continue, the Latino community at this time at the receiving end of violent hate crimes, growing violent hate crimes, I should say, at least according to data that has been compiled by the FBI itself and its own admissions in this regard. Who is behind this? What is behind this? How and why is this rising? Is it down to, as Begona there said, ignorance? And we do know, in fact, that hate a lot of the time does come out of simple ignorance, which leads to fear and then leads to hate crimes and people carrying out physical assaults as well against, quote unquote, the other communities which have been ostracized. We'll keep a close eye on that, of course, because the Latino community, as we well know in the U.S., is a very large community and has a lot of political power in that country as well. So it'll be interesting to see if such violent hate crimes do affect the 2020 elections as well and become an issue for those election campaigns and those candidates. I'll be back, though, with my next segment after this break. Stay tuned. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. In this segment, we're going to discuss hate speech coming out of both France, Italy, and now even Greece, essentially. Earlier, we were speaking about U.S. hate crimes, and it's important to discuss that this sort of thing is also happening in Europe in a different guise, of course. In France, we had an anti-Islamophobia rally take place in the French capital, Paris, which was even denounced by the government, interestingly. Then in Italy, we've had a report come out about a poll that has been carried out there in which Italians say, to an extent, that certain racist acts are justifiable. And that, of course, is disturbing, even in the context of the fact that Italian police have just recently foiled a plan by right-wing extremists to blow up a mosque in Siena in central Italy. Now, just before coming on air, I was reading, in fact, about a story coming out of Greece, where a far-right group in a village there held a pork and alcohol barbecue outside a migrant camp, which was full of Muslim asylum seekers. All of this, of course, points to a disturbing trend across Europe. Let me introduce our guest who is joining us to discuss this further. We're joined by Lara, Laviola, the political analyst of European affairs. She's joining us now from the Italian capital, Rome. Lara, thank you for your time today. What do you make, Lara, in the context of Italy, of course, of this poll in which Italians, again, not all Italians, but many Italians say racist acts are justifiable?
Well, I would say it's until 2017, we could think it was a marginalized phenomenon. but today we should not, of course, dramatize the phenomenon, but it's quite worrying, I would say, with Salvini polling at 34.5% right now, and with the other far-right party, Brothers of Italy, which is on the rise. So I would say that this poll, although it takes in a sample of just 1,500 people, it's quite true as with its result, because it says that the 10% of people think that racism is acceptable, and that and half of them think that racism is acceptable depending on the situation, which is more or less the same on my opinion. So I would say it is quite now right now. It represents totally, truly the perception of the Italian population.
So why has this happened, Lara? Why do Italians have these opinions now?
Well, I have to say that we should broaden our view on Italians, because it's not just a matter of racism, but I would say that it's more a matter of social aid, which is strictly connected to this matter. For example, we experienced some racist attacks against football players, against senators, against politicians, and against women. Women in politics are the most attacked with sexual insults. So I would say that it's strictly related to social aid. Not to forget the attacks against Carola Rackete, the German woman leading migrants to land Italy. So I would say that the thing is that Salvini in particular and the League has a strong, a clear and sharp story to tell the Italian population, which is very frustrated, I would say, and it's still orphan of the system, of the ideological system of the last century. So right now, Salvini is the only one who has a story to tell. And so the problem is that the left party in Italy is very weak on this, and it has not a clear orientation on this, and sometimes it seems to
Lara, if you allow me, I wanted to you are an expert in European affairs as well, of course, so I wanted to ask you about the trend across Europe then when it comes to this issue. Do you think that all of this is happening, as sometimes it is argued, because of the refugee crisis, and that there are many Europeans who believe that their way of life is under attack, that the soul of Europe is being changed, that their culture is changing, etc.? Do you think that is the reason why many Europeans are becoming more racist?
Definitely, yes. But again, it's still a matter of perception more than a real datum, because the last reports of the United Nations, for example, says that this old continent is not one of the first land in which refugees flee generally. So So I think, again, it's more a matter of frustration. It's not a case that we are experiencing the years after the financial crisis of 2011. And for example, if you think that in 2009, in Italy, we used to have more than 50,000 irregular immigrants, and it wasn't a problem. It wasn't at the heart of the public debate. Like now, after 10 years, after a financial crisis, which affected Europe and Italy more than other countries, and now we have half that number. We have more or less 26,000 irregular immigrants, but the perception is that we are overwhelmed by these immigration flows. So it's again a matter of perception more than other. So it's more or less the same in Germany. If you think to the rise of Nazism, of new Nazis. And you think that Germany is at the moment one of the countries without unemployment, without almost without unemployment, without economic financial problems. So again, it seems that is a wide rise, which is not strictly related to a real situation.
All right, so Lara, we'll leave it there at that. But of course, we do sincerely appreciate your time speaking to us there from the Italian capital, Rome. That was Lara Laviola, who is the political analyst and an expert, of course, in European affairs. One of the important things when we're discussing this is, as Lara there said, this is about perception. It's not really down to, as the arguments are put forth by many of those who are now more racist in Europe, it's not about the refugee crisis. That's a fairly newer phenomenon, and refugees have in fact been showing up in Europe for many, many years. And Europe is certainly not the continent that has taken the most refugees, as we well know, of course, at this time also. So that's not a justification, certainly, for all of this. And it's not even the economy necessarily, because as Lara also pointed out, Germany has a fairly good economy, yet it has a rise of neo-Nazi parties there, and neo-Nazis even in government now, and gaining in popularity politically, as well as, of course, we've seen in Italy as well, with Salvini's party and other such parties gaining popularity in that country also. So it's more down to just perceptions and people's racism just coming out now in Europe and, of course, across other parts of the world as well. We'll keep, of course, a very close eye on that, because this is a disturbing trend which is spreading very quickly across Europe and across much of the Western world as well. I'll leave it there for now, though, for this edition of Scope. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.